Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about history. This has always been one of the most interesting topics to me, and one that I have always been interested in, and that I have always intended on doing videos about. But to date, other than reading the Bible, most of my commentaries and other videos have not concentrated on history, so this will be my first ever history video for this channel. And it is appropriate that it is on the first of a month, April 1st. Today is April 1st, 2019, according to the Julian calendar. As you know, I use the Julian calendar and not the Gregorian calendar on my channel, which is not identical. April 1st was also at one time the New Year, so Happy New Year. Now, with that said, I would like to go over a little-known historical nation, and that is the nation of Avastia. Avastia may sound like it would be a rather large territory if you think of the word vast, but it actually derives its name from the nautical term avast. This is because it was actually an island nation founded by seagoing merchants. During the Age of Discovery and Sail, the great European powers were charting the world and laying settlements that would eventually grow into their colonial empires. They would frequently make use of tiny islands dotting the Atlantic to make stops, either to port during a storm, to rest, to gain more raw supplies for repairs, or just as ports of call to do trade in a more convenient location. One of the most popular of these islands came to be known as Avastia. This was because the word avast in nautical language means to cease or to stop. So the island was known as Avastia because it was a good place to stop. We don't know exactly when the sailors began naming it this. It was sometime around the 1590s, but what we do know is that mapmakers took it as the official name sometime around the year 1600. Sailors would constantly go to and fro. The great European powers would use it as a stop to go to the Americas or to go from the Americas back to Europe, and merchants would frequently make use of this as well. And it is because of the merchants' love of this place that it became a separate nation. You see, Avastia was not claimed by Portugal, Spain, France, or Britain, the great powers that were growing into colonial empires. But each of them had initially ignored the island simply because it was so small and so universally used. But as it grew in importance and prominence in the transatlantic trade of goods, many European powers thought to seize it for themselves, which would of course put them at an advantage in controlling a major shipping hub. But the merchants of the world at the time didn't really like this idea because they wanted to maintain free trade of goods that would ensure their money flow stayed very diverse. They wanted to be able to sell to everyone, and Avastia, in addition to being a port where you could stop, was also somewhere where you could sell goods without any customs being applied to them. As a result, learning about various European governments thinking about annexing Avastia or setting up a colony there, and realizing what that would mean, various merchants got together, pooled their funds, and set up a permanent base of operations on the island. This grew into a city governed by merchants that declared itself sovereign and independent, but also neutral in European wars. And this neutrality is exactly why it is not well known today, because it didn't get directly involved in any of the great European wars or struggles or colonial expeditions. It simply served as a port of call and free port to trade goods. Initially, some European powers resisted recognizing Avastia as a separate power. But it was hard to determine who should get it because the merchants who set it up were not from any one country. In fact, you had from all over Europe various settlers and various merchants who wished to maintain their particular trade. You had Dutch, German, Finnish, even Norwegian settlers. in addition to French, Spanish, Portuguese, and of course British. As a consequence of all of this, of course, the land of Avastia spoke many different languages, so they actually settled in terms of a governance language on Latin. Latin was the language of the intellectual elite, and most of the well-respected merchants who headed grand merchant guilds were in fact educated, so this was not an issue. They never imposed Latin on the populace, but they nonetheless conducted governing business in it, and many people would hold conversations. It became so common that some of the common men even began speaking Latin in itself, and eventually created their own variation of it called Avastian Latin. But for most of its history, people spoke Portuguese, French, Spanish, Italian, German, or English, and the island began to develop little enclaves of people who spoke that and came from various national or ethnic backgrounds. This cultural divide did not seem to halt the functioning of Avastia, since the capital still remained very compact, and most people spoke Latin in the capital, but it did lead to certain divides and clashes between various subordinate villages. Avastia as an island is only about 60 by 100 miles. It is a large island, but still a finite area, and much of it is rocky and submerged part of the year. The actual livable portions of Avastia are only between 30 and 40 miles, and the capital city of Avastia, also known as Avastia City, was only about 20 of these miles. The rest was made up of smaller settlements and villages. The government of Avastia was actually controlled by the Mercantile Guild of Avastia, which was a guild with members of various wealthy merchant families. It was not truly a monarchy, but it wasn't exactly a modern republic either. Rather, it was run something like a corporation with a board of directors and an elected CEO, but the CEO was elected from the board by the board. However, there was a House of Burgesses that was elected by the common people, and together this formed a sort of parliament. They had no clear head of state. The CEO, while the chief executive, did not serve the same role as a president or a king would. He simply represented the board and took care of day-to-day operations as an executive figure. Nonetheless, he took on a certain degree of prominence and was, in fact, seen as a sort of head of state in a de facto fashion. Avastia managed to maintain itself through trade and kept out of most of the great world affairs. For example, when the American Revolution happened, they did not side with America or Britain, but simply allowed mercantile ships to pass through, and when it became obvious that the war would demand they take a side because they allowed ships to go through, and one side would inevitably invade if they thought it would stop their military rivals, Avastia decided to declare that no military ships from America or Britain would be allowed to port at Avastia for the duration of the war. Only mercantile ships would be allowed. There was a problem with this, though, as France was also included in this once it joined the American cause. And France decided to send some mercantile ships that were really gun-running or transporting troops. If this was ever discovered in the Avastian ports, they arrested everyone that was involved and held them for the duration of the war as prisoners of war, even though Avastia was neutral. This was actually a controversial move within Avastia itself, with many within the Burgesses considering this a very dangerous move. Many people within the board or the Burgesses thought that this could be used as justification for war with Avastia itself. Luckily, it never came to that, as too many people wanted to keep the port open for merchant business. The American Revolution was primarily driven, after all, by economics. Contrary to popular belief, it was not mainly about freedom from tyranny, but, money like everything else. At any rate, Avastia managed to remain out of the American Revolution, And after America was completed, American merchants were welcomed to trade within Avastia. Likewise, after it was obvious that hostilities had died down, in 1815, the Avastians allowed military ships from the British Empire and the Americas to once again port there. After all, the two powers had made peace and hadn't been fighting for years. However, that began their precipitous decline. Britain, having lost the American colonies, turned its attention to other parts of the world and acquired India. This, in addition to the continued trade with China, meant that they were going around Africa and toward the east and headed southward. They no longer headed toward the north to arch into what is today Canada and the United States. Oh, don't get me wrong, trade was still done there commonly, but as America was a young country, it did very little international trade and in fact could not afford it. So it was reliant heavily on the British Empire, which was now becoming the world's preeminent power, and the French Empire. But France was too busy with its Asian affairs, and Britain was too busy with its colonies in India, China, and Russia. It is a little-known fact that the British Empire set up colonies in the Russian frontier. Because of this, and because Japan was offering such open free trade at the time, Avastia began to see fewer and fewer merchants relying on it. And then something else happened. In Avastia, in order to shore up more trade, they developed faster ships that could get you across the ocean using new sail alignments faster than the previous ships. At first, this was argued to be a source of revenue since they could sell the ships and the designs for them, but it was also thought that if the ships could move faster, then more trade would occur and people would stop at Avastia. Instead, people used the faster ships to travel between each other, bypassing Avastia. This actually led to a certain critical failure. And that critical failure was, if people are no longer in need of stopping at your island, then how does your island maintain trade? Avastia needed to find a way to bring people to the island, but more and more people were bypassing the island to go thither and yon using the faster ships that they themselves had designed, while at the same time making cheaper copies of those same designs or simply copying the idea, whether legal or not, to get their own ships faster. This in addition to the fact that more and more of the international trade was dealing in Africa and Asia and no longer bothered with the Atlantic but with the Pacific, we ended up with a situation where Avastia was fast losing money. Then, in 1848, a hurricane passed through the area, destroying the port. The wealthy families dumped a lot of money into the new ports, as well as renovations into the city, saying that it's an excuse to make the place look very much better and perhaps create a new environment. But because they sunk so much money into their properties, they could no longer maintain their own enterprises. Soon the wealthiest families were dropping out, and new families were vying for control over the council, essentially the board of directors, if this were an actual company. Then racial, ethnic, and lingual barriers that had been a plague upon Avastia's unity for years began to show up. People began to show more loyalty to people who spoke their language and came from the same general background, and even showed loyalties to their ancestral nations, some of whom actually came from those nations because they moved to Avastia during its mercantile years. Then civil unrest broke out, with many camps trying to get Avastia to be a colony of one empire or another, while others wanted to maintain its freedom and independence. Others sought to restructure it away from a purely mercantile government into something that could be perhaps more useful in the modern world, such as perhaps a political and diplomatic nation where people can send people to make treaties and various other international deals. But everything fell through. A second hurricane hit in 1866, leveling the city, and this time no one wished to pay for its repairs. As a result, most of the families and peoples involved simply left Avastia, leaving behind only about 300 people. Today, Avastia as an island still contains a very small population who largely descended from that group. Some people have moved there over the years, but more have moved out. Its population has stabilized, but for years was in a decline, losing approximately 1% every decade. But getting back to the point, Avastia was formally dissolved as a government in 1878, but retained a provisional government until 1890. With the dissolution of it, all the little villages became somewhat autonomous, and some became parts of the various colonial empires, but only on a village level. This was, of course, unworkable. Finally, the island of Avastia was simply annexed into Greenland and became part of the Dutch Empire. It ceded from that and became part of the British Empire later on, and was annexed in as an overseas territory of Canada, which is what it is today. It is largely an autonomous territory of Canada. There are moves to make it independent once again, since it does seem to have its own lifestyle and culture, but those moves seem fruitless considering the population is so small and they are heavily reliant on Canadian goods. I hope you enjoyed this video on the history of Avastia, and I also hope you realize that it is an April Fool's joke. There never was a nation of Avastia. I'll let you go now. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.